Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Zhuang, for the presentation. Very interesting. I'm going to pick up just on some of the key messages of this very comprehensive report and presentation. The first of these concerns the trends in income inequality, as Dirk has just also summarized and highlighted. We see in some countries, so about 11, 12 countries out of the 28 countries for which you have data, an increase in income inequality between the early 1990s and the end of the 2000s. And particularly in large countries with high population, so notably Indonesia, for instance. So this is one first, I think, crucial message. The second one is that fiscal policy has a role to play in addressing these trends. And the report emphasizes a shift, in some sense, in the understanding around the role of fiscal policy, where up until recently the prevailing understanding was that fiscal policy's main role was to support growth through enhancing macroeconomic stability and so on, which is of course one of its roles, but that there is potential for it also to try and tackle income inequality increases. And again, I think this is a very welcome message, partly because we know, of course, that fiscal policy can be very effective in reducing income inequality. And certainly if we look at the experience of European countries, but also more recently Latin America, where in some countries we're looking at a decline in income inequality, fiscal policy, so spending and tax policies, are contributing to this reduction. So for European countries, for instance, if you look at the distributions of market income and compare that with the distribution of disposable income, the difference in the inequality there is considerable, and we know that that's the taxes and transfers that are leading to this very significant reduction. And again, considering Latin America, which, as you correctly point out, has very high levels of inequality and certainly much higher compared to the countries in the region you're describing, the difference there is that we're seeing a decline in trends, and fiscal policy is playing an important role there. So again, I think this is a very interesting and timely message. The third issue that emerges and has also come up in your presentation in some sense is how critical it is to consider not just spending but also tax. So we're interested in understanding the role not just of education, health, social protection spending, but also the role of the revenue side. And for many years, and certainly in many publications, the focus has been on looking at the incidence and distributional effects of spending, which is absolutely, very interesting and critical. But of course, this only tells part of the story. And ideally, we would want the full story. So yes, we're interested in knowing where spending goes and whether it's contributing to alleviating poverty and redistributing, so towards reducing inequality, or whether it's reinforcing inequalities. But we also know, of course, that if we don't take the tax side into account, we are missing part of the story. We may see, and this is what we see in many countries, that spending is, for instance, maybe progressive, but that once we start looking at taxation, we actually find that the regressive tax is offsetting the progressive incidence and contribution to reducing inequality of the spending. So we do, we are looking forward to this full picture. And you did mention also in your presentation the question of having the data required to do this type of analysis, and I think many of us are looking forward to improvements in the data in order to permit this type of analysis moving forward. Another point concerning policy, there's the question of taxation, and there's a comparison is made across by macro region. So you compared in your presentation for instance, tax to GDP ratio of Asia or developing Asian countries with that of the OECD countries and Latin American countries, which is useful. Of course, it's a very aggregate picture. But that tells us something about, well, it tells us two things. I mean, on the one hand, it tells us that absolutely there does seem to be scope for these countries to increase revenues from taxes, and this is, again, very promising and holds potential. In terms of the composition of the revenues, we see that from this aggregate picture, at least, there is scope to increase revenue, in particular from certain areas, so certainly income tax, social contributions, for instance. And this is very, very promising. On the other hand, of course, we know that all these considerations need to be made at the country level. So the appropriateness of a particular tax reform will necessarily depend on the economy of the country, the labor market structure, and existing policy. Yeah. And the report, I note, of course, also contains the country-by-country analysis, which is very interesting. And finally, on the spending side, well, we know that spending, the potential for public spending to affect income inequality depends on its incidence, but also on the levels of spending, right? So we're interested in both, and you show very clearly that in terms of levels of spending, there's scope to increase them. So certainly in comparative terms, countries in the region are spending less than also comparable countries elsewhere, so there's scope to increase spending. In terms of the incidence of spending, there's a study quoted in the report that shows that on the one hand, education and health spending seem to be progressive, and in fact are more progressive than what we find in other regions. But a striking finding is that social protection isn't. Yeah. In fact, it's regressive. Yeah. And of course, we know why this might be. There are a number of reasons, and the report cites, for instance, that both social protection spending and spending on housing may be regressive because they are focusing primarily on urban areas. So that's one dimension. And you just showed the issue of spatial inequality, so this and urban-rural inequality. So this may be one of the reasons why we see this pattern. But it certainly, again, points to the fact that there seems to be quite a lot of room for improvement in terms of ensuring that social protection spending, housing spending is pro-poor. Yeah. Particularly because these are categories of spending that directly pursue an objective in terms of poverty reduction, right? As opposed to, say, education and health, which are universal, more universal in nature. And I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Francesca, thank you very much, and sort of highlighting also the shift in objectives for tax policy, maybe from growth to distribution issues, and also highlighting the issue of taxation as well as spending in the role of fiscal policy, and unpacking that. Oliver, over to you.